Well, good morning, Capital Rivers Church. It's great to be together with the East region of our church family. If you're a guest with us, we're so grateful you decided to join us this morning. And I really do believe that these sacred times together really do help us with, honestly, it's the first time in certainly my history that we've experienced this long withstanding kind of community trauma that we've experienced this past year. No other time in recent history have we experienced the same pain during this pandemic, and I do want to recognize that. This is not what we would say as normal, but it is a new normal that I'm just grateful that every single one of you, both our guests and our long-standing members, have decided to trudge through the storm with us. And honestly, 2021 is already a year to remember. If you're like me, I feel almost puzzled just every time I look, and almost to this point where I'm not surprised anymore with many of the things that we see going on. And I do know that this is not new in history as far as experiencing some of the things that we have been, but it truly is a lot. And I just want to validate that. I want us to recognize that if you feel like it's a lot right now, you are not alone. Now, as a church community, we've been looking at this concept of being connected. And for the next couple months, we've spent some time looking into what it means to be connected in the Word. And when you think about the Word, it's quite miraculous, the fact that this text, although many of us might seem like it's archaic, the more you study it out, the more you apply these scriptures to your life, the more you realize. And it's almost like, it's like listening to that Lauryn Hill song, right? It's like he's strumming this pain with his fingers, singing my life with his words, killing me softly with his song. It's like, how did you know? How did you know that was part of the very weaving of my experience? And I don't know if that's been your experience. Maybe you read the Bible and you're like, what in the world is this? This seems like so removed from my context. My prayer is that we are invited into engaging, that truly, when we are connected to the Word, that we start to realize that, man, not only do we get to be connected to a text that's lived throughout all of these years, but we actually get to be connected to the Creator God that wrote those words in the first place. You know, last week, Phil talked about the idea of God teach me. And there's certainly a lot of things to learn, especially if we posture ourselves in reading the scriptures as if the person who wrote those words created you. And maybe if you're joining us for the first time, or maybe if you're trying to navigate through faith, maybe you don't have a faith. I do invite you to engage in the Bible in this kind of way. And perhaps you can see where that takes you. But picture this. It's sometime in the early first century. You're a widow. And to the men in the audience, I know it's really hard to imagine yourself as a widow, but indulge with me. But you're left with children. You're grieving the loss of your loved one. And then all of a sudden, these officials from the city come to your property and says, I know you only have this in your name, but you need to leave the premises quickly. As you think about the request and think how unfair it is, you also think about that this is the only thing of value that you have in your name other than your children. That you don't want to lose this, even though your property is not large at all. It's probably only big enough to fit a pigsty. You are being kicked out by the city officials. What are you feeling? Well, one, in this culture, you have no voice. In this culture, you have a very little value. Think about it. You're poor, you're widowed, and you're defenseless. In Jewish culture in the first century, what is it that you want more than anything else? You want to be judged. You want a judge that can see your case. You want a community of just witnesses to be able to understand how unfair the situation was. You want nothing else but to be judged. In that culture, to be judged was to be seen, heard, and given a chance. In this culture, when you say you will be judged, it's not necessarily lilies and daisies that you think about. Oftentimes, when we think about judgment today, it usually means some sort of consequence, damnation, a guilty conscience that will be seared because of the crime that was committed. But as we read in the scriptures, you'll notice in the Psalms, oftentimes what happens is actually the writers, especially King David, he asks of God, judge me. Oh Lord, won't you judge me? If you said that today, it'd be a bit of a head scratcher, right? In our culture, it's seemingly the last thing we want to experience. But as we unpack this passage, I want to invite you into the understanding that to the Christian, to the one who chooses to follow God, that actually judgment is exactly what you want. And why? Because God's judgment does the following. God's judgment, it puts pain into perspective. God's judgment perplexes the perpetrators in our lives. And God's judgment promotes His people to places they have never been before. The title of today's lesson is God, Judge Me. Let's read together here. Starting in verse 65 of Psalm 119. Do good to your servant according to your word, Lord. Teach me knowledge and good judgment, for I trust your commands. Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I obey your word. You are good, and what you do is good. Teach me your decrees. Though the arrogant have smeared me with lies, I keep your precepts with all my heart. Their hearts are callous and unfeeling, but I delight in your law. It was good for me to be afflicted, so that I might learn your decrees. The law from your mouth is more precious to me than thousands of pieces of silver and gold. Your hands made me and formed me. You give me understanding to learn your commands. May those who fear you rejoice when they see me, for I have put my hope in your word. I know, Lord, that your laws are righteous and that in faithfulness you have afflicted me. May your unfailing love be my comfort, according to your promise to your servant. Let your compassion come to me that I may live, for your law is my delight. May the arrogant be put to shame for wronging me without cause, but I will meditate on your precepts. May those who fear you turn to me, those who understand your statutes. May I wholeheartedly follow your decrees, that I may not be put to shame. This passage is full of power. As I read it, I start to wonder what must have King David been going through as he's inscribing the words on this scroll. This thought of judgment really does ruminate throughout this passage. But as we go through what God's judgment helps us see, the biggest thing I want us to walk away with is that when you have God's judgment, you are able to be the light in the darkness that this world has been searching for. God's judgment, first and foremost, puts pain into perspective. In verse 67, it says this, before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I obey your word. And if you go down to verse 71, it says, it was good for me to be afflicted so that I might learn your decrees. I don't know about you, but when you read that, sure, it sounds pretty epic in nature as a poet. But think about what he's actually saying. He said, it was good for me to go through pain. It was good. I don't know what kind of sadist you are, but oh my goodness, what do you mean it was good for you to go through pain? I admit, I'm not just speaking for my generation, but I think our collective generation hates pain. And that's actually not necessarily a bad thing. I don't think any one of us wish pain naturally upon each other, but really there is this posture that the writer takes and says, you know what? It was actually good for me to go through pain. When he learns God's judgment and he keeps asking God to help him see things and see the world and see especially his pain through his lens, he learns that, you know what? This pain had a purpose. If you're like me, I run away from pain. I try to do the most I can to help myself avoid any sort of pain. And that could be physically. I know for me, and many of you know, my struggle with my own chronic illness and diabetes. That's a pain I don't want. First thing I asked when I got it, and that fateful day with my diagnosis, I said, why, Lord? Why me? Why now? Why not someone else, right? The why. But the reality is, for me, there was pain in that purpose. And now I have the gift of hindsight to be able to look back. But wow, I think oftentimes physically we run away from pain. I know for me, with conversations that are hard, I do not like to have difficult, confrontational conversations. Why? Because in my nature, I'm someone that just blows a fuse. I feel this sense of, I want my case to be heard. And I feel this sense of defending myself in my own type of way. What about you? How do you deal with pain naturally? Do you try your best to run away from it? Or when you go through it, do you actually cripple your mind from not even being able to see the perspective that God is actually trying to stretch? If you're going through a hard time right now, I do not mean this to minimize your pain. I truly don't. The reality is that when we go through pain, it is difficult. And God knows that. But let me ask you this, in your pain, do you just wish it away? Or do you wish to learn the lessons that possibly God is trying to teach you through them? Paul is a great example of someone who lived as a powerful man. He was a Pharisee, a teacher of the law, respected in his community. He was a terrorist to Christians. He went out and tried to imprison them. He sanctioned the killing of Stephen. He was an assailant. But as he became a Christian and was stopped by divine intervention, and instead of killing Christians, he made Christians, he started to see that, the life of a disciple was not easier for him. It was in fact more painful. But he grew in his perspective that his aim in Philippians 3, verse 10, he says, my aim is that I may know him and the power of his resurrection. And get this, I may share in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death. It is a bit crazy to follow Jesus. It's a bit crazy to have a relationship with God. It truly is. Why? Because it just denotes a life of no comfort. Rather, a comfort in something else. In the brink of the war to end all wars, World War II. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a theologian and a big proponent of teaching true discipleship in the modern era at the time. Being born in what we now see as Poland, but at that time was occupied by Germany, and during the duration of World War II was under Nazi regime. He was a big proponent of speaking against what was against the Scriptures. That many people were being sucked into a mindset that was evading God's teachings. He spent some time in the U.S. and actually forged some schools to be able to train young ministers, train young Christians to be able to learn the way of Jesus. But as he saw the turmoil of his countrymen, the turmoil of those he loved most in his homeland, he decided with much trepidation to go back and preach the word in Nazi Germany. And when he went, he spoke against some of the mandates that were imposed upon Hitler's regime. And as he became more public, and as his message became clearer and louder, the Gestapo stopped him and brought him into a concentration camp. There's no humanistic happy end to Dietrich's story. The reality is, his message, though it stayed and permeated throughout time because of Jesus' message, he found death. He was hung and brutally executed. The details of his execution are a little finicky as they tried to dramatize the beauty of his death, but really it was ugly. It was full of pain. He was praying, but it was a painful prayer. But I reckon Dietrich must have thought what Paul thought, that Jesus looked into the face of his assailants and said, "Forgive them, for they do not know what they do." Like Bonhoeffer, God is trying to put purpose in our pain. Yes, it might seem as though living a life of pain can only end in disdain, but the reality is that you and I are invited to be able to share in the sufferings of Jesus. The next idea that God's judgment brings perplexity to our perpetrators. Let's keep reading together in verse 74. It says this, "May those who fear you rejoice when they see me, for I have put hope in your word. I know, Lord, that your laws are righteous and that in faithfulness you have afflicted me. May your unfailing love be my comfort according to your promise to your servant." God's judgment brings perplexity to our perpetrators. You know, I can imagine King David as he's writing this. And I can imagine the temptation he must have felt throughout his journey in these caves, running away from the likes of King Saul and many others that were jealous of his connection with God and his victories. I can imagine King David wanted to get even. But what's interesting is the more that King David made sense of his pain, the more he was able to have a God's eye view of his situation, the more he asked and seeked God out to help him discern and have the judgment of God to actually perplex his perpetrators. You know, throughout the thread of the stories of the Scriptures, even we see in Jesus' example, as I mentioned earlier, imagine being on the cross looking into the faces of your assailants who just hours before slashed your back, put a crown on your head, a thorny crown, and twisted it as blood gashes through your eyes. And you looking at them and having the posture to say, "You know what, God? They have no idea what they're doing. Forgive them." How confusing is that as the assailant? I can imagine me being the person that brutalized Jesus, that I might be like, who is this crazy guy? He's confusing me. You know, when our nature says get even, what God's judgment actually says is get confusing. You know, the reality that we face today is that many are oppressed in many different forms. Doesn't matter the country, it doesn't matter the conflict, and it doesn't actually matter what side of the coin you are on. Many people on both sides of the political spectrum, again, this isn't a sermon about politics, but it is an understanding of where we ought to posture ourselves according to God's judgment. But the reality is that no matter who we are, many of us are in some way, shape, or form oppressed. That we experience a perpetrator that wrongly or accuses us of something and treats us with contempt. But the question isn't necessarily if you are oppressed, but how we deal with that oppression. Later we'll talk a little bit more about this idea. But we have an opportunity, if you are someone that experiences pain, to perplex your perpetrator. In 1960s London, England, MBE Constable Leroy Logan. He grew up with an experience that traumatized him for his life. After he left a day after school, he was the last one to be picked up from a parent. He was literally waiting for his father. As his father approaches him, his father was stopped by police officers and brutalized right in front of his eyes. What should have turned him off to authorities inspired him years later, after he received his PhD and had a career in chemistry. He decided he wanted to be a police officer. As he went through schooling and got and scored in top flight in his academy, he became a constable, a police officer in his hometown in London. As he became an officer, he was ostracized by two communities. One, his own. As he walked through the streets where he grew up, people called him a traitor. They called him a Benedict Arnold. They called him a Judas. And when he was in his own police force, he called for backup when he was trying to apprehend a criminal, and no one showed up to support him. Constable Leroy Logan decided, as a black man, to decide, I'm still going to pursue justice as a constable because my people need this decision. That I want to create bridges between people and not burn them. That the communities do need to grow in their expansion of understanding of how to live their lives. But the police don't need to be the enemy. That they're actually there, like me, to serve and protect. Years later, he became one of the most important figures in pursuing justice and pursuing a rightful law in London. But it was a bit puzzling for everybody, wasn't it? He perplexed his own community and perplexed those he served with. That it was not an easy pain to rummage through, to pursue and persevere the life as a constable. But with his courage and with his eyes on the prize, he decided to stay on the course. And thus he perplexed the many. When our nature says get even, God's nature says get confusing. For you, are there moments that you overlook the opportunity to perplex? That instead of punching back, you turn the other cheek? That instead of wishing death upon those who wish death upon you, that you wish for something even greater? Life. Which brings me to my last idea. That God's judgment brings promotion to his people. Let's keep going in verse 78. It says this, "May the arrogant be put to shame for wronging me without cause. But I will meditate on your precepts. May those who fear you turn to me, those who understand your statutes. May I wholeheartedly follow your decrees, that I may not be put to shame. You know, we have an opportunity to confuse the corrupt by our conduct. You know, there's a beautiful quote that was said from Dietrich as he passed, was that we ought to let our life be a rebuke to the oppression that we all receive. That no matter what, you will not be bested by it. But what's interesting is even as we think about this, right? There is a posture that King David takes. He says, look, put to shame those who unjustly, wrongly accuse me without cause. I think oftentimes all of us can relate with that in some way, shape, or form. That maybe pain is inflicted upon us when we didn't necessarily deserve it. But as he says that, he says, look, I want to learn from you. And here's how God calls him higher. And perhaps this is what places the greatest honor of all, is that we get to have the judgment, the mind, the statutes, the law of the Lord. You know, as last Monday was Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And as a man who really pursued civil rights, he pursued building bridges, not burning them. One thing he said of those who were experiencing perpetrators, he says this, it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man, he ought to lift himself up by his bootstraps. You know, what's interesting is that we have a culture sometimes that says, you know what? You gotta get up. You gotta fight back. You gotta be strong. But what's interesting is that we learn, even according to God's judgment, that all of us are guilty. That every single one of us are guilty, and every single one of us have someone that is against us. But what's interesting about the words that MLK so eloquently stated, perhaps the most anxiety-filling aspect of being a follower of Jesus is being promoted to being a light for others. Or in other words, in your rejection from the world to provide advocacy for others. You know, the word advocate is denoted when Jesus talks about the coming of the Holy Spirit. And when those of us that became disciples of Jesus, we were given the safety deposit of the Holy Spirit. The advocate, or in other words, a champion. In Hebrews chapter 4, verse 16, it says this, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet was without sin. Therefore, let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. In John chapter 14, verse 16, it says this, I will ask the Father, as Jesus is leaving his disciples for good. He says, I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper, that he may be with you forever. That is the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it does not see him or know him. But you know him, because he abides with you and will be in you. I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you. You know, the common thread of all of this is that if the disciples have been given this advocacy, this helper that is able to bestow the judgment and the wisdom and the law of the Lord upon his people, that we actually have a higher calling. We are put in a position that we get to see the world as God sees it. Now that is a daunting responsibility. It's scary. Especially when you consider you and me. I look in the mirror sometimes and I'm like, I am not that big of a deal. Me, God? Man, my natural judgment is so skewed. I'm so partisan in my nature. But man, I know that if I learn from the law of the Lord, I will not be put to shame. And you know what? When I see those who do not have the advocate, have the helper, the Holy Spirit bestowed upon them, it is my responsibility to be the best example of that I can be. You know, Amanda Gorman, the youngest ever inaugural poet, said on Wednesday, "There is always light, only if we are brave enough to see it. There is always light, only if we are brave enough to be it." These are not new ideas. They are a reflection of God's righteous and holy judgment, that He so desires to judge the world according to the Son He has provided. Notice the juxtaposition in this passage. It says in one way, "May the arrogant be put to shame for wronging me without cause, but I will meditate your precepts," right? Which sounds relatable for all of us. But then there's a flip, a sobriety flip. It says, "May I wholeheartedly follow your decrees, that I too may not be put to shame." What does this mean? It means if you and I and the world around us get to have the judgment of God, the mind of God, the discernment of God, we have a chance not to be put to shame. Imagine if you and I got to participate in that. Imagine if every moment that envelops friction, if you have another chance for His judgment to shame the wise. It's a sobering task to be a child of the light. It's daunting, it's full of responsibility, but it's just what you and I need. It's certainly what this world needs the most. So even as we think about our relationships with one another, we ought to have that sobering approach. Let's seek God's judgment together. Why? Because God's judgment brings beautiful light. It puts pain into perspective. It perplexes the perpetrators, even when we are the perpetrator. And lastly, it promotes His people to becoming the light, to becoming the helpers themselves. If we all possess that helping advocacy, that spirit for one another and all humans around us, we'll get to see the ones who really don't have the advocacy themselves. That those who don't have the bootstraps to tie themselves, that those who don't even have boots to be able to walk in the steps of Jesus in the first place, that you and I get to help them tie their bootstraps. That we're not fending for ourselves here. That we're not looking at people and saying, you made a bad decision, so, good riddance. The reality is that you and I, when we were a time of need, that we received a grace that put the boots right on us so that we could walk the steps that Jesus has paved before us. As we reflect on the cross right now in communion, remember the blood that He shed for us. And it's not just ceremonial, but it's actual blood, pain, that Jesus put into perspective so that you and I can receive God's righteous judgment. Because if we were judged according to ourselves, man, we'd have no chance. But because of Jesus, God looked at us and said, you know what? Man, I am proud of this child of the light.